Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon and welcome. Today is Tuesday, April 8th, 2025. It's 3:30 p.m. and this is panel number 18136 called Transforming a Planet in Peril. Does biodiversity really matter? The synopsis of this session is that non-human species are going extinct at an alarming rate. To what extent does declining biodiversity threaten healthy ecosystems upon which humans depend? Is there a tipping point? Given the trajectory of human population growth, is ecosystem sustainability actually achievable? If so, what are some practical steps we can take in a democratic society to face the challenges and achieve sustainability? I'm very pleased to be here today. My name is Sharon Collinge. I serve as the director of the Arizona Institute for Resilience at the University of Arizona, which is an interdisciplinary research institute focused on co-creating knowledge to enhance societal and environmental resilience to environmental change. I was also a professor of environmental studies here at CU Boulder for almost 25 years, and I'm pleased and honored to be here with these amazing panelists today to discuss this very important topic of our time. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure that you, the audience, get a chance to ask questions during this session. So here is how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the last 20 minutes or so of the discussion for the audience Q&A, and we're using a note card system to receive questions from you, from the audience. At any time during this session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers there at the back of the room. Thank you. Please write legibly so that I can read it. And if you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer, who will bring it up to me, and then I'll go through those questions of our panelists. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. So thank you for that. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist, and then they'll have a chance to provide some opening remarks. For more information on their bios, you can find their full bio on the CWA website, and I'll keep my introductions fairly brief. So I'd like to start with Nancy Knowlton. Nancy has been a leader in marine biodiversity and conservation for over 3 decades. In the citation for her award from the Heinz Foundation in 2011, they noted that Dr. Knowlton started a series of events called Beyond the Obituaries, Success Stories in Ocean Conservation. That gives you a sense of Nancy's hopeful spirit. The program celebrates marine conservation efforts that are making a difference so that rising scientists who want to help save the oceans can learn from and be inspired by the success of others. I follow Nancy on Blue Sky, the social media platform, and every once in a while she writes a "My News to Me Good News" entry, which I love. So if you are so inclined, check out Nancy on Blue Sky. Ted Schmitt is the Senior Director of Conservation for the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. He has applied technology to tackle conservation challenges, particularly in Africa. Ted calls himself an accidental conservationist, and he may explain why, and a conservation technologist. He writes that the lack of policy properly informed by science has led to unsustainable development at a global technology-enabled scale. How we apply science and technology reflects what we value. And third, Terry Chapin, who is an Arctic ecologist based at the University of Alaska since 1973. And Terry has been largely responsible for formally shaping our scientific understanding of the ecology of Arctic ecosystems. And these ecosystems are increasingly important as we face the effects of global climate change. Chapin's research in Earth stewardship explores ways that society can proactively shape changes toward a more sustainable future through actions that enhance ecosystem resilience and human well-being. In the Volvo Prize citation that Terry received in 2019, they wrote that Professor Terry Chapin is not only a world-leading ecologist, he is also one of the world's most profound thinkers and actors on stewardship of the Earth system. So I think you'll agree with me. I'm honored and humbled to be sitting next to these three people who have such amazing creativity, brilliance, and insights into our current situation. So I'd like to turn it over to Nancy for her opening remarks. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Sharon, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This is my first time at this conference. I'm really enjoying it. So I was chosen to start this off because I am actually a card-carrying biodiversity scientist. And this means I have to set the stage and talk about the biodiversity crisis. And so I'm going to keep these remarks as brief as possible, but there is going to be a certain amount of bad news. And as Sharon indicated, this is way off brand for me. I've spent 15 years now talking about success stories and solutions, but you do have to understand the problem in order to solve it. So bear with me. This will be short, but important to recognize. So I didn't actually start off as a biodiversity scientist, but I spent about 3 years in Jamaica studying something that I thought was one species, which then turned out to be 3 species, and I've been basically a biodiversity scientist ever since, trying to figure out what actually is living in the ocean and on the planet, and also why that biodiversity matters. I mean, the bottom line about biodiversity itself is we have no idea how many species there are on the planet. I used to put out little condominiums underwater, leave them there for a year, and use DNA to figure out how many species there were in them. And something this big could have 7,000 species, and I'm not even talking about the bacteria and the viruses. So there's huge amounts of biodiversity out there. For the ocean, probably 90% of it does not have a name. So needless to say, if we've never studied it, never named it, we have no idea of how important it is. We do know something about what we've lost in terms of biodiversity, and paleontologists talk about the 5 main mass extinctions that we've experienced during Earth history. The worst, about 250 million years ago, 96% of all the species on the planet, based on the fossil record, went extinct. And then 65 million years ago, about 76% of all the species went extinct. Now, that second mass extinction was the one caused by the asteroid, which resulted in our not having dinosaurs except for birds around with us. It's that asteroid event is what is now used to describe what we're doing. I have an artist friend who gave me a pin that says "We are the asteroid," and it's the 6th mass extinction is real, but I think it's really important also to put it in perspective. So after the ice ages, people armed with very, very primitive weapons managed to wipe out about 175 large vertebrates, and since about 1500, we've caused the extinction of 900 more. So that's 1,100 mostly large things that we've caused to go extinct. some small things more recently. And that seems like a big number, and in fact the baseline extinction rate is about 1,000 times higher than it would be without what we're doing. But there are something like 10 million species at least, maybe 100 million species, maybe even more still out there. So it's, some people do say, okay, so we lost 1,100, we've got 10 million left, does it really matter? But what has really changed is the abundance of different species. And I went to check the numbers in a wonderful website called Our World in Data. If you haven't ever looked at it, it's full of all sorts of incredible information. So if you took all the mammals and put them on a giant scale, have to be obviously pretty big, 62% of the weight of that scale would be our livestock. Another 34% would be us, and only 4% would be wild mammals. And obviously, before we were around, all of it was wild mammals. For birds, similarly, 71% of the birds are poultry in terms of weight, and only 29% are wild. And even insect abundances are starting to really decline, something that ecologists never worried about for many years. Now, what's interesting is we actually haven't lost biomass of mammals. In fact, there are 10 times more weight of mammals on Earth now than there were before people started having so much livestock. And the reason we've been able to do that is because if you take away the glaciers and the deserts, and then what's left is called arable land, we've taken about 44% of it, and about 2/3 of that is used to support our animal protein consumption, and 1/3 of it to support other kinds of food for us. So we've basically taken the earth and transformed it into a giant farm. So needless to say, there are many species that are on thin ice just because there's not that much space for them to live anymore compared to what they had before. And that, of course, doesn't even take into account the increasing risk of extinctions and abundance loss caused by climate change. So I'd like to just finish up with one quick story back from Jamaica. When I first went to Jamaica as a grad student, the bottom was covered with living coral. About 70% of the bottom was living coral. And there were hardly any fish. There were no sharks, no big groupers, nothing like that. There were little things that ate plankton, but almost no fish. And yet we didn't really worry about the corals. In fact, we took the corals for granted. Then about 1982, the Black Death for this one species of sea urchin, the black spine sea urchin, arrived and swept through the entire Caribbean, and it killed 98% of these sea urchins. A single species, Diadema antillarum, but in an area that used to be able to see about 20 of them in a space about half the length of this table. Then you could swim for hours and not find a single one. So it makes even the Black Death, much less COVID, look like child's play compared to what happened. So that's one single urchin. 10 years later, we had, instead of 70% living coral, we had 5% living coral. And the reason is because those sea urchins were the only thing eating seaweeds in the absence of fish. So it's a perfect example of a tipping point and why we really do need to pay attention to biodiversity, even sometimes species that we might not have thought previously were important. But with that, that is the end of my bad news, and I'm going to turn it over to my compatriots here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy. I'm sure we will have questions and comments about what you've just shared with us. That was a lot of great information. I'm going to turn it over to Ted.
Great, thank you. I think I'm close enough there. Great examples of how science can help us understand what's going on, also can provide answers. I guess I will introduce myself. Sharon mentioned it, but I came to conservation late in my career. That's why I sort of call myself accidental conservationist. Now I'm fully, it was sort of my calling that I didn't find until I was about 45 years old. I started my career as a technologist and then got frankly bored with helping create the next widget to do some random thing, and I wanted to do something that was meaningful. Thankfully, I do want to mention that I get to work with a lot of young engineers who are working at AI2, the Allen Institute for AI, and places like it, because they also want to do something meaningful and not just, improve Google's ad clicks or whatever. So that's very encouraging to me. And so I also wondered why weren't some of the problems, not just conservation, but healthcare and many other problems not being addressed with technology? Why wasn't technology being applied? And of course, the simple answer is that there's no money in it, because that's what we're driven by, and we value that. And I think Terry's going to talk about other things that we value, or that we should value, and that many of us do value. But really, that's a part of the answer. And of course, the other thing is, I'm sure pretty much everyone here knows what a wicked problem is and the definition of that. But that there are these side effects and system problems, and so those are the problems that interest me. And then, as I said, I sort of came to conservation by working for Paul Allen, a philanthropist and co-founder of Microsoft, who was very much concerned about what was happening in the ocean and to biodiversity, and wanted to see technology applied. And so it was really a coming together of my technology background with a policy background that I had gone into, and then finding out that I actually loved conservation and bringing all of those things together. And the first conservation project that I was involved in was called the Great Elephant Census. That was in 2014 and 2015. It was the first time that all 20 African savanna elephant range states were surveyed within a short period of time, mostly because it costs too much money and the money's never there to do that. And he was able to make that happen. It was a huge effort, and many, I think close to 20 different NGOs worked with us, and governments on the ground, and a major coordination effort. Those of us who are technologists were shocked to learn that the way aerial surveys are conducted is by having two people sit in the back of a Cessna and stare out either side of the plane and write down the numbers of animals they see. And we're in the 21st century. And so I was like, oh my goodness, we can do better. And in fact, we have supported and funded and developed technology now to apply computer vision, so an AI capability, to look at images as planes or drones or satellites. Are not quite the resolution yet, but to be able to do that counting. I could give you a long, I think interesting, you might find boring, discussion about how us developing that technology doesn't mean it gets translated into policy and things like the Convention on Trade in International and Endangered Species. There's a whole process that has to happen to get that technology adopted. We're still in the process of making that happen, but the technology can advance that, make it cheaper and faster and better for us to understand what's happening, not just with elephant populations, but with other species populations. What we learned was that there were, and the number's humorous by its accuracy, 352,271 African savanna elephants. Obviously, we have no idea that it's exactly that, but within error bars, the scientists have a high degree of confidence. What does that mean? I started asking myself, like, well, how many elephants should there be? Is that good? Is that bad? 20 years earlier, there were 600,000 elephants. And in fact, and the reason we got involved was during a period of about 5 years, there was an elephant poaching crisis in Africa, and the population went down 30% in 5 years. 100,000 elephants in one reserve in Tanzania, the Selous Game Reserve, were killed in a matter of 3 years. So think about that, 100,000 elephants in 3 years. And so 10 million elephants in 1900, 350,000 today. But what is the right number? And I also looked this up because we're at CU Boulder, and the mascot is a buffalo. It's actually an American bison, not a buffalo, but there were between 30 and 60 million bison roaming the North American plains in 1800. At one point, we're down to a few hundred. And today, and a hopeful message is that there are between 250 and 500,000. Only about 30,000 of those are considered wild or free-ranging. But that is a conservation success story, and I think we could all share a number of incredible conservation success stories where if we put our will to it and somebody said, wait a minute, I don't want the bison to disappear from the planet, and we can bring them back. And there are some amazing success stories there. And I think, at the beginning of every panel, there's the really wonderful statement about indigenous people that lived here. But think about all the bison that lived here before too. And it's impractical, impossible, in fact, for us to have 30 million buffalo roaming out in the plains with all of us living here. But what is the right number? We've decided apparently that 0 is not the number we want, but 30 million is probably impossible. And so, I think the takeaway for me is that science and technology can help us understand and manage for whatever our goals are, but they can't set those goals. Our values, what we value, has to set those goals. I'm very excited about what technology can do, and I can share many more examples of what technology can do to help, but ultimately, we have to actually care and have the values to understand and know what we're aiming at. For good or bad, we humans manage the planet. We do. I think Nancy said it very well. We've kind of turned the planet into a farm with a few pockets of wildness left that some of us cherish very deeply, and I think more people are starting to be aware of that. And then I just wanted to end by saying that there's a little very obscure paper by a fellow named Eric Sanderson. He also wrote a wonderful and much better known book. It was a New York Times bestseller called Manhattan, which was about what Manhattan looked like as an ecological paradise the day before Henry Hudson showed up. And that's an amazing book. He wrote this little paper called How Many Animals Do We Want to Save? And I found it because I was asking myself that question, like, what's the answer? And he does a nice job without too much technical lingo, but with all the proper science around it to sort of characterize that. And of course, the summary in the end is that we are making, I'm quoting here, we're making decisions about how many animals live with us, and thus we need to make those decisions from a carefully considered, ethically consistent, and clearly articulated view of what we want from nature. And I will leave with that thought.
Thank you, Ted. I think there's a lot in there about technology that we can explore and values for sure. Terry.
Thank you, Sharon. So Ted and Nancy have given you very compelling evidence that biodiversity has radically declined. Why should we care? First of all, I think ethics is at the core of this. Why does one species, us, have the right to determine the fate of so much of the biodiversity, so much of the species that exist on this planet? But then the flip side of that coin is if one species caused that problem, we're the ones that are in the best situation to fix it, and that's our job. Secondly, biodiversity gives us more options in an uncertain future. Nature shapes the environment, and that environment determines whether humanity either thrives or suffers. And by providing a broader range of potentially favorable biotic environments as a result of having species that can live in lots of different places, we have the opportunity to increase the likelihood of conditions in which humanity can thrive. So that's a very selfish reason for all of us as people. Thirdly, as Ted was indicating, biodiversity connects directly with our core values and identity, and it contributes to the sense of place, the places we live, the places we love. And it's because of the diversity of those landscape, the diversity of the plants and animals and the microbes that we don't see that result in the character of these places that we come to identify. And our identities determine many of the choices we make about what we do, the things we buy, the things we choose to protect. So these they, so these determine many of the short-term, these determine many of the short-term outcomes of human interactions with nature. Many of the places in which people identify with, however, are heavily modified. And I'd like to put in a pitch for the biodiversity of human-modified landscapes as well as the pristine places. There's an incredible diversity in many agricultural systems. Certainly not the greatest number, the greatest total area of agricultural landscape. And there's great diversity in urban environments, suburban environments, and all the places in between those and the pristine places. So that's another thing that I think begins to connect us to solutions. Because if we care, and because we identify with these places, then we have opportunities to change this. And there's ways in which we can connect more closely with the places about which we care, or about which we could learn to care about. So let's go to solutions. I think one approach at a very broad scale is to think a lot about synergies in addition to trade-offs. We often think about the trade-offs between short-term economic gain and environmental degradation. But there are also lots of synergies. The places that we protect, or the places that we allow to provide the kinds of environmental conditions and ecological conditions that allows us to enjoy living there, allows us to thrive. These are the sorts of things that provide the long-term benefits for society. So I think thinking about biodiversity loss is not a zero-sum game, but a place where there's opportunities to build biodiversity, to protect that which is remaining, are really encouraging. So thinking about some practical paths forward, I think one of the problems that has resulted in so much environmental degradation and loss of species is our focus on short-term economic benefits. So if we redefine what matters to us as a society, we can define this economically in terms of the inclusive wealth of society. This would include the material wealth as infrastructure is built, as individuals acquire goods. But it also depends on the natural capital, the economic value that exists in nature, and also the potential loss of some of that economic value when those lands are degraded and when species are lost. So we add that into our economy. Then we think about human capital, the educational capital, our capacity to have the knowledge to make wise decisions. And finally, the social capital, our capacity to work together, to collaborate, to come up with solutions that reach across political and cultural divides. So I think there's some good ways in which we can take the economic system, continue to use that as a metric, but just define our economics more broadly so that it includes all of the things that affect us in terms of our well-being. And those can, in many cases, be given some metrics that have economic value in addition. So I think a lot of it is focusing on institutions that can support long-term goals. Because if we're going to have this broader economic definition rather than just GDP as a single number to define our economy, then we need to think about the long-term institutions that allow us to maintain all these other dimensions of our economic well-being. So then to think about strategies for moving towards this broader definition, or to think about ways in which we can interact more ethically with our landscapes, I think there's a couple ways in which we can shift the likelihood that we reduce the degree of overconsumption that society has at present, or change the kinds of the ways in which we consume. And one of these is by policies that influence incentives for people to make choices, whether they choose to bicycle to the market or choose to drive a car. The kinds of choices we make about things we buy, places we live. But another way to do this is to shift social norms. And social scientists have worked on this really carefully, and they have some very pragmatic strategies for shifting social norms. Now, I'm not a social scientist, so I can't give you chapter and verse about this. But just think about when you put out your recycling bin, your neighbors are going to notice that. If everybody starts putting out their recycling bin, or everybody except 3 people, well, they're going to do it too. If people begin to admire somebody for using a car towards the end of its useful likelihood rather than buying a new car every other year, people are going to notice that. If people value the benefits of electric cars versus fossil fuel-based cars, that's another way in which we can influence and shift social norms. Another way is by gathering, by getting organizations to which we belong to begin talking about these issues and thinking about the sorts of positions they would like to express on these issues, and then encouraging other people to join groups that have these sorts of perspective. There's lots of nonprofit corporations that do lots of wonderful things in terms of environmental benefits. So I think there's lots of ways to move forward, even within a more classical economic framework. And then there's lots of ways to just think about it in terms of our relationship with nature. And that's the sorts of places where I feel we have the best opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I want to follow up on some things that each of you have said, and I want to highlight an increasing interest and movement, especially in Europe, for including nature in the balance sheet of corporate actors. So in a similar way that carbon markets have been constructed, is there an opportunity for biodiversity markets? And this is something that is somewhat controversial, but I want to return to our panelists and ask first Nancy. The Biden administration made significant strides toward creating this kind of model with their creation of the National Nature Assessment, which was meant to assess nature and then to begin to move effects on nature into the accounting system of the government. So you've been on the National Nature Assessment. It has now taken on a new form under this new administration. But how close do you think we are to pursuing this kind of model in the U.S.? And then I want to ask Ted about the assessment using technology, and maybe ask Terry about how indigenous worldviews might fit into this structure. So go ahead, Nancy.
Well, the Trump administration canceled the National Nature Assessment, just to be clear. And federal employees, those that remain, unfortunately, are no longer able to participate with us. But the rest of us who are not federal employees have gotten together, and some people have been very active in raising money. And so the final name hasn't been decided, but it will have a different name just to set it apart from the National Nature Assessment. But the effort goes on. I was on not surprisingly perhaps, I was on the Bright Spots chapter. But in terms of, this is really a question of policy. China has been a leader in using nature to make decisions about, policy decisions about how the country is run. Right now, the United States is obviously going backwards. In fact, efforts to remove the consideration of environmental costs in terms of any kind of assessment of economic value. But the economic value is real, and it's not just the economic value of biodiversity sort of narrowly. It's also quite clear that what are called nature-based solutions can make a big dent in terms of addressing climate change. And that also has, anything we can do to address climate change has real economic benefits as well. So as the wonderful speaker we heard last night said, that we live in a world of a pendulum. Things right now are not great. They will get better again. And I have no doubt that, that people will start increasing, not only, I mean, it's already happening elsewhere, and in the United States it will happen eventually as well. It's just for the next couple of years it may not happen very effectively, at least officially. There are other things that are going, around the world there are also efforts, not just by indigenous people, also societies giving legal rights, say, to rivers and things like that. So there are legal efforts, there are just sort of fiscally wise decision-making processes, and then there are these biodiversity credits. I think we have to be careful with the biodiversity credits. The carbon credits, some of them have been really badly abused, and they've given the whole effort a bad name. So it's not a completely, easy recipe to follow, but I think there's certainly some potential. And there's no question that there are a lot of communities that benefit from biodiversity. Ask the communities that surround Yellowstone, if Yellowstone is helpful to them, the biodiversity of Yellowstone. People go to Yellowstone not only for Old Faithful, they go to see all the wildlife, and that's true of a lot of national parks as well. So there are countless examples where biodiversity is worth real money, and we will at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, come to our senses about that in the United States and elsewhere where decision-making is sometimes more rational. It's already being done.
Well, and you talked about the example of the coral reefs and the seaweed kind of overtaking the coral reefs. That's a huge problem right now in the Caribbean with the sargasso seaweed. I don't know if any of you have traveled to Mexico or certain places in the Caribbean. It's just covering the beaches, and the economic impact on tourism, I would think, would be significant.
Yeah, it's almost too much biodiversity on the beach.
Yeah.
But
well, that's
actually,
an invasive species, isn't it?
No,
Or
it's
is
not an invasive. It's actually a very interesting story. It has to do with changes in the ocean. People, it's not my real expertise, but my understanding is at this point people feel that there was what's called a regime shift in terms of ocean currents,
Okay.
and some of it's part of the great Sargasso seaweeds, and some of it escaped and got into a different part of the ocean, and then is now sort of propagating and maintaining itself in these new locations. I think one thing that's happening is that people are starting to use it as fuel and
it's very creative.
And fertilizer and various things like that. But yeah, sometimes biodiversity can be in the wrong place. But
yeah. Ted, talk a little bit about how technology might help us with national nature assessment, and then subsequently maybe helping us understand some of these biodiversity markets as they emerge.
Yeah, I've actually looked a lot at the biodiversity credit market, and I share Nancy's reservations, I'll say. There's essentially a whole set of international frameworks being set up on biodiversity, recognizing the biodiversity crisis, that directly parallels what was set up starting 30, 40, 50 years ago for climate. There's, I forget all the acronyms, but there's a task force for nature-based financial disclosures, which is a World Economic Forum effort. There's SBTN, which I forget the acronym for that. There's SEBA, there's on and on, but there's a whole set of framework. I have a nice chart actually with all the climate stuff, and then what's been set up in biodiversity, and there's a couple gaps that will undoubtedly be filled. But as Nancy very correctly said, the climate markets, the attempt at climate markets, while I think laudable, at least by some actors, was co-opted in many ways, and there was absolutely greenwashing and then exposure of that, and they've collapsed, and people are trying to resurrect them. Where technology comes in there is that part of the problem with carbon markets, and that would be only amplified by biodiversity markets, because carbon is at least you're measuring one thing. you're measuring how much carbon there is, right? Think about how complex it is to measure biodiversity. Like, what do we even mean by that? And certainly the scientists give us some things. There's something called the essential biodiversity variables that some really bright scientists have worked hard on. They're deeply complicated, and we can talk about how technology could help implement those and make the implementation of those easier for governments who are trying to do the right thing to understand what they're doing and how they're hitting against targets, and that's where technology could come in. But ultimately, we still have to set the goals that we want to achieve with all these frameworks. And we actually have to agree that these are good goals. And as Nancy said, you know, there isn't agreement, at least in the United States right now, about that, and we're heading very much in a different direction. But the mechanisms, the policy frameworks are getting set up on the biodiversity side. The setting up a credit market, and there are a lot of really smart, passionate people trying to do this, and technologists. I can show you a chart of like 300 startups in the space, which I'm both dismayed and heartened by at the same time. Heartened because there are some really smart people who could probably go make a lot of money doing other things, and they're invested in this because they some of them certainly still want to make a lot of money, but they also care about the planet, and they're trying to invest in this space, which is really hard to create these markets. And I think that's encouraging on one side, and the technology is starting to be there with AI and so on to make it possible to understand what we're doing. It still doesn't solve the problem of what we're aiming at, right? And we still have to figure out what we're aiming at. And if we can't even agree at 1.5 C, I don't know how we agree on what biodiversity we want. So huge promise for technology, and technologists really in the space trying. I'm really proud to be at the Allen Institute for AI, where the whole purpose and the whole mission of the organization is to apply AI for good purposes, one of our pillars of which is being for the environment and for conservation. And there are a number of other organizations doing that as well, and that's very heartening. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I didn't want to, disparage all carbon credit schemes, but they have to be additional. In other words, they have to be doing something that they wouldn't be doing otherwise, and they have to be durable. And so it's sort of like AI or anything else. You can do it right or you can do it wrong. It does a lot of damage when it's done wrong because it discredits other efforts. I mean, I'm on the global board of the Nature Conservancy. We do a lot of work with carbon credits. We haven't really done too much with biodiversity credits yet, but the money that is generated is absolutely fundamental in terms of doing important conservation work on the ground. So they can be very valuable. They just have to be done right.
Yeah, thank
That's
you
great.
for that clarification.
Yeah, and I would just add, in terms of, and I think this will go right to what Terry really talks a lot about, which is stewardship. One of the things I found dismaying and frankly shocking, I was talking to a lot of the carbon project folks, and there is a lot about additionality, about doing something you wouldn't have otherwise done to add to the sequestration of carbon. In conservation, so much of the folks that we work with, they're stewards. They're trying to steward and preserve what we have. And I would ask some of the carbon folks, well, how would we support those folks? We can't do that because that's a counterfactual. That's the term I heard. It's a counterfactual, so we can't have a market out of you just continuing to do good things for this space because we don't know how to value that. And we need to figure out how to do that, and I think there's some people putting thought to that. But I think for biodiversity, we need to be able to support stewardship forever, and people get paid to be good stewards of the land. So,
with respect to counterfactuals, actually you can use counterfactuals, but you basically find comparisons elsewhere, what allows you to estimate the impact of what this kind of effort does typically, and then you can use that. So we use counterfactuals for example, to to determine that there's been a huge positive impact of the Endangered Species Act in terms of saving species. So the question is, what would have happened if we'd done nothing? And we can't actually answer that question.
Nancy, I'm so happy to hear that, because the folks I was speaking to were economists, not biologists. So, and I know TNC's done a huge amount of work on this, so I will broaden my knowledge.
I'm going to jump in here and just ask Terry, you've done a lot of work with indigenous communities, especially in the Arctic. And, you know, the indigenous worldviews often would not assign a monetary value to nature. And in fact, perhaps land can't even be bought or sold under that worldview. And so I wonder if you've thought about how the biodiversity markets might articulate with indigenous worldviews, especially since a lot of the areas that are managed for biodiversity are managed by indigenous people.
That's true. About 25% of the wildlands are the homes of indigenous people who effectively manage those lands. So it's a large part of the terrestrial surface. I've learned so much from the native communities that I've worked with in Alaska, and especially about their attitudes about stewardship, about living in these lands and shaping the way these lands exist so that for the benefit of their communities as well as for the long-term benefit of the landscapes. And for example, in Alaska, almost all of the villages are off the road system. You have to get there on the rivers or by plane. And so people depend very much on hunting and gathering for their food supply. It's what they need. It's part of their livelihood. It's what they need in order to continue to live in these places. In other words, it's really essential to their cultural integrity and the future of these cultures. So it's really important to them, and they think a lot about the value of individual species and what's happening to changes in the abundance or the time of berry production of a particular species. Why have the salmon disappeared from the rivers? These are things that come home to them very strongly, and they certainly have a strong sense of the value of this relative to what the world would be like in the absence of that. Well, I could tell stories about that, but there's some really telling anecdotes about how people's attitudes about this and their value, not their economic, but their personal value of resources such as salmon has strongly influenced the way in which they live on the lands and the sorts of arrangements they've made with state and federal departments of fish and game to manage the salmon. So it's something that is important to them. They've figured out the value of it, and they've translated that value into policy changes that operate for the state of Alaska as a whole.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to some questions on the note cards, getting lots of great questions. We're not going to be able to cover them all, unfortunately, but we'll see how many we can get through. So this one is from a student. I'm a student in the eBio department here at CU. I used to be in that department. Awesome. I see how AI can be useful for solving many environmental problems. What do you have to say about the environmental consequences of AI, such as water waste and the space required to run these programs? And I'm going to look at you, Ted, to start with this at least.
Yeah, so
others can comment.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd say AI and technology can't solve the problems. It can help provide tools to solve the problem. So I always qualify that. You can use AI to work at a scale and a speed. I think the Great Elephant Census, doing that by collecting imagery and running it through computer vision algorithms, is a nice example of how that can be done a lot more easily, quicker, and less expensive, and in fact safer for both the animals and humans flying around. But what's done with that information is what solves the problem. So, and then on the second half of that, yes, absolutely, that is a concern. how much energy it takes to run the algorithms, how much water resource, how much energy resource, the huge amount of data centers being set up along waterways, and I live in Seattle, and up along the Columbia River Valley, there's booming enterprises setting up these data centers to run these systems. I do think the costs and expense and energy required will come down over time, just because technology will advance. But it is a real concern, and I think we have to really think about how much energy are we burning, how much environmental impact are we having for running these systems, and then what benefit are we deriving from them, right? So if we can manage for and hopefully good environmental outcomes that we've set, and the AI gives us the power to do that, and the environmental impacts can be understood and reduced as much as possible and then contained, then we can make a real proper comparison about the trade-off there. But yes, that is a trade-off that we do have to think about.
Thank you. This person writes, we're meeting at a university. Could our speakers, particularly Nancy, address what students could work on to address biodiversity, especially in the marine environment?
Thank you for that question. To understand biodiversity, there are lots of. To me, the most important advance in terms of understanding biodiversity is the use of this DNA technology, which I briefly alluded to. You can take samples and in what you might have taken, by traditional looking at things through microscopes, it might have taken 2 or 3, 5 years to analyze the samples. You can now analyze them in an afternoon just by running them through a mass sequencing approach where you get basically a telephone book of everything that was in your sample. So as Ted said, it's what you do with that information that's really useful. It can be used, for example, to detect invasive species. It can be used to figure out the ranges of things. So it's sort of limitless. In terms of actually protecting biodiversity, there are just so many ways. When people ask me, what should I do as a student? What can I do? There's so many different approaches. It really depends. You can do everything from policy. You can use the arts. When I was at the Natural History Museum and at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., one of our most successful exhibits, for example, was something called the hyperbolic crochet coral reef. It was about 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. It was like 4,000 pieces of crochet made by about almost 1,000 individuals. And part of it was colored, and part of it was white to symbolize coral bleaching, and part of it was made out of plastic and to symbolize pollution. And we reached out to a lot of different communities. It was one of our most popular exhibits because it brought people into the Natural History Museum that wouldn't otherwise have come if they were not necessarily interested in science. My favorite, actually, of all the press coverage I've ever gotten, my favorite was the headline in Street Sense, which is a magazine by and for homeless people, that said, homeless women stitched their way into the Smithsonian, because some of the contributors were homeless women.
Great.
So that's the arts. That's at one end. We heard a lot about the arts, actually, in last night's the role of the arts in executing social change. There's all this stuff in technology. And then there's working with people, which is sort of, this panel actually really illustrates kind of the breadth of approaches, because what Terry does working with people so much, you've got policy on the top-down side, and you've got people on the bottom-up side, and you really need both to really to accomplish change in a kind of resilient and durable way. So you can work in policy, that's the social sciences, or you can work with community activism, that's social sciences, there's economics, there's DNA, there's the arts. I heard this morning, somebody, it was one of the students who was turning, this was actually astrophysics, but she was turning data into music and getting people engaged with data by turning it into music. Really you want to find, I have a former student, wonderfully influential colleague, really megastar in terms of climate marine science, named Ayanna Johnson. I don't know how many of you read her book.
Yep, she's amazing.
And she has this Venn diagram in her most recent book, which is called What If We Get It Right? And it's sort of this combination of what needs doing, what you're good at, and what brings you joy. And it's the intersection of those three, which I think is a very valuable way of thinking about it. So the possibilities are limitless. It's a question of figuring out, where you fit into that realm of possibilities I do a lot. What I do now bears absolutely no resemblance to what I used to do too. So you can do different. You don't have to make a decision and have it, say, okay, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. You might do it for a year. Well, that was another message from last night. You can change. That was interesting, but it's actually not what I want to do forever. So do something else. So there's what you really need. I think this is related to that Venn diagram. The most important thing you can have for this work is passion. And if you have the passion, then everything else will follow.
Yeah. That's amazing that Ayanna was your student.
She was my husband's student,
Oh,
but she
okay,
was in the
okay.
program that I created at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
Okay.
So that's how I know
Yeah,
her.
if you haven't heard of her, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, What If We Get It Right? Book that just came out last fall. She's got some great podcasts too. Related to that question that you just answered, this is on ground truthing data on biodiversity, forest monitoring, or ocean pollution. The question is, what role can and do citizen science platforms play in data collection and ground truthing technology? What role can outdoor enthusiasts or students play? So a related question, but I wonder if you want to jump in here, Ted or Terry.
Yeah, how many of you have an iNaturalist account?
Yeah.
Great. Everyone should have an iNaturalist account. And an eBird account, and I'd love to see them get together. In fact, talking to them about that. And Merlin, if you haven't used Merlin, these are all wonderful examples of citizen science platforms that are creating enormous amounts of wonderful data. And so that's one thing you can do when you're out hiking. Get your iNaturalist app out, or your I think it's called Seek, which is more plant focused, and contribute. Of course, you also see that there are some very data-rich areas where people have their smartphones and they're taking pictures and they've got their iNaturalist accounts. And place where I work a lot in Africa, that's a much sparser data set. It's still a data set, and it's wonderful, and people are thinking about more and more ways to use that. A lot of the iNaturalist, I think all the iNaturalist data now goes into something called the GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and I think citizen science can absolutely contribute in significant ways, and it's easier to do that than ever because we have these phones and we can record what we're seeing. So, yeah.
It's
Terry,
also
has that been a
wonderful-
part of your work?
Yeah,
The-
It's also a wonderful benefit for the citizens that collect this information. It connects them more knowledgeably to the world they live in and care about.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the reason these platforms have been so successful is because they're giving something back. It's not
Right.
just a one-way thing. It is a very much. I love knowing what bird did I just see, and I've slowly become a birder. I'm not even close to some of my friends who are real birders, but I just took a trip to Nebraska and went and saw the sandhill crane migration, the largest migration in North America, and it was amazing. And I wish everyone would see that. I think Terry's done so much about talking about connecting people to nature. I also just mentioned, I don't know if there'll be another moment, but I'm also concerned a little bit. Like I saw Meta, Facebook had an ad for a while and they were trying to sell their augmented reality thing, and they had children experiencing a mastodon through this augmented reality experience, and I thought, oh, that's cool. And then I thought, ooh, that could replace actual real experiences with wildlife, right? And so just, I think these platforms, though, they don't disintermediate you from wildlife. They actually connect you to it. So, yeah.
I'm going to, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say a big chunk of what we know about who are the major contributors to plastic pollution comes from citizen science recording the nature of what the litter is on beaches. So there are all
That's
sorts
terrific.
of possibilities. Yeah.
Huh, I didn't realize. Is there a specific app for that?
I'm sure there is, but
Yeah.
I'll have to
That's
check.
really interesting, yeah. I'm going to shift a little bit. We talked about this somewhat yesterday. We met briefly yesterday as a group. How do we move the public discussion of conservation from single species to that of the whole ecosystem, all flora, fauna, and fungi therein? Thank you. Is what this person writes.
Well, it's all part of the same thing. I think something like citizen science, which begins to notice lots of different species in a place, gets you a good start on that. And I think getting the conversation towards thinking about what are the functional consequences of the changes that we see. For example, there's programs in Alaska that keep track of berry production in all of the villages in Alaska. And so people get out there, they go out berry picking anyway, and they just keep notes on that stuff. And it makes them much more aware of how climate change is affecting them, and also more aware of what many people might overlook if they just saw, well, there's bushes with berries on them, we're okay. And so that, I think those kinds of things of connecting the biodiversity with the functional consequences can be really useful, and especially connecting with the social consequences, because it's the social consequences that are more likely to influence the actions that people take.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I would just say, I think, what do they call it? The keystone species. I'm going to get my ecologist friends are going to correct me, but there are species that humans connect with. It was called the Great Elephant Census, even though we counted every animal that was a buffalo or bigger, because people connect with elephants, right? So that can be, let's call it, that can be a gateway to getting people more involved in what's involved in the ecosystem and the function of the ecosystem, and the fact that elephants, need to use the ecosystem in a certain way. That means it has to function in a certain way. So you can start explaining those things. I also last year got to go to the Atacama Desert and see flamingos, which is people go there to see flamingos. And then the guides, who were actually quite good, were explaining about how the mining that's a couple hundred miles away was draining the water table. So all of these places where the flamingo roost were disappearing or getting smaller and smaller because of that. So that was explaining how the ecosystem is being impacted by humans. But I and all those people were there because we wanted to see the flamingo. So I think you can explain ecosystem function and more complicated things by getting people interested in the things that are just naturally they attach to.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I would add that, well, first of all, if you've got 10 million species, there's no way you're going to protect all those species with the Endangered Species Act. You've got to sort of focus on places, and I think that's something that people can understand. But beyond that, for example, Bill Frist, who is the chair of the Global Board of the Nature Conservancy, he's a former majority leader of the Senate, a heart transplant surgeon, and he's now working on a book on the benefits to human health of being near healthy ecosystems. So there's a direct human health component. I mean, some of you may have heard of forest bathing, and actually there are places where you can get prescriptions for basically going out to nature. So there's a very important human well-being, in addition to sort of the other things that we're thinking about associated with healthy ecosystems, which often is something that people really care about.
Mm-hmm. Here's another great student question. This student asks, when looking globally, how do we prevent parachute scientism, especially when we have a desire to solve all of the world's problems? So really important ethical question here.
Absolutely.
Terry, do you want to take that, given...
I'd love to take that one,
Okay.
because this has been a real issue in Alaska that has created an incredible amount of distrust between Native communities and the scientific community, because the tradition has been for Well, I'll just tell you this story. I invited a Native leader to come and talk to our class, a graduate class in sustainability, about Indigenous perspectives on sustainability. And his answer was, you've got to stop doing the science you're doing with communities. It's just not right. You parachute into a community, you do what you want to do, you collect the information, you don't talk to the people in the community, and then you leave and the community never learns anything about it. And it's that and some even more destructive practices have created a real tension between Native communities. And so now if I want to work with a Native community, I'm not going into a Raza Blanca, I'm going into a situation where there's a certain amount of distrust, and any kind of collaboration has to build on trust. And that is always the first and most important element of working with a community, I've found.
The Nature Conservancy has an expression that progress proceeds at the speed of trust. And trust is very slow to build and very quick to dismantle. So it's absolutely essential.
And I can put a technology spin on it. I think the most important, I think the project that I'm most proud of is something called Earth Ranger, and you can look it up. It's used by over 800 parks around the world now. And I had the privilege of starting and leading that program in 2015. We're still running it today, and I can tell you most of the technology projects, and they are projects, not programs or products, they're literally parachute. A Western technology comes in, we can solve this, they do something, they've got 2 years of funding, they get their CSR story or whatever it is, they disappear and say, well, we can't pay for this forever. You have to start paying, and most of the communities we're working in can't pay. And so and again, it all starts with trust. We spent 4 years, the first 4 years, we're working on the technology, but sitting down with people and understanding what they needed from the technology, asking them questions, building a sense of ownership from them in the technology that we were providing them, and really shaping it to them, and then showing up every year and every month and making sure we're there to support them. And unfortunately, most of the funding, certainly for technology, is not structured in a way to do that. It's sort of go in, figure out the problem, build a solution, and then, okay, you're on your own. You have to figure it out from here. And so that element of trust is just as essential in applying technology for real adoption and real change as the science.
We are sadly getting to the end of our panel, so I know that all three of these panelists are in additional panels tomorrow and Thursday. So look at your program. You can hear more of their wisdom tomorrow and Thursday. But I want to ask and I'm going to borrow from Nancy, ask each of you to quickly reflect, and literally we have 3 minutes, so you got to be really quick. This is what you call it, news to me, good news story. What's your favorite one recently? Some good news that you heard recently that gives you hope for where we are related to biodiversity. If you're not ready yet, Nancy, I can go to Ted or Terry. What's something that's you heard recently that's just giving you an injection of hope?
Heard recently, Terry? Or
heard, read, seen, learned.
Go on my Blue Sky account. I post every day, but then I forget what I've posted.
Yeah. I guess I do see every day, like now with Earth Ranger, we're literally having 8-10 parks a week adopt the system, and that's personally very, very rewarding. But it also tells me that there are lots of good people out there trying to do good stuff. And maybe the other one I would say, I don't know if it's an immediate good story, but every day I see new graduates coming out of university who have computer science degrees and can go make a lot of money at a Google or an Amazon, who want to work with us or with organizations like ours. And the only disappointing thing I'd say about that is there aren't enough places for all the people that want to do it. We only have so many places, and I send them to the other people that I network with, and there's actually more demand from young people starting their careers to
That's
get into
great.
these spaces
Yeah.
than there are spaces for them.
That's great.
I've got one now.
Okay, good. Go for it, Terry.
In a lot of the native communities where I work, much of the science now is being designed and implemented by local people, the whaling captains, the berry pickers, and other people in the communities. They are doing the science.
Wow, that's amazing. That's terrific.
As I said, I have so many of these stories. I post 1 or 2 a day. There are thousands and thousands of them. Most of them, or many of them involve, as you said, Native Indigenous people. I'm particularly fond of the ones that involve women taking charge of their environments, doing things to, say, plant mangroves, which bring huge fisheries benefits, but also shoreline protection. Right in the front here, Joni Kleifus works with communities of people working on coral reefs and making huge progress. I would go talk to Joni about some good news on the coral reef front. And I actually would like to close with a sort of more general statement, which again comes from Our World in Data, Max Roser. He says it's really important to hold 3 things in your head at once. One is, and then sort of translating this for biodiversity, is the world is a mess. The second thing is, but it used to be much worse. And for those are all the examples, the whales that are recovered. I mean, just driving to the airport to get here, I almost hit 2 turkeys on my driveway. And turkeys, I didn't know this until relatively recently. Turkeys almost actually went extinct. They're one of countless species that we saved from extinction. So things have gotten much better, the buffalo, but things could be better still. Those are the 3 things you have to hold in your mind at the same time. They don't contradict each other. They exist simultaneously. And the reason I post all these success stories is that they show that it is not too late, that there's another book that's been written called It's Not Too Late. There's so much progress being made both for protecting locations and protecting species, but also I take enormous hope from the progress that's being made in terms of renewable energy. Yes, we could adopt it more quickly, but the cost, I mean, to me, the most incredible good news is not directly biodiversity good news, but the fact that the cost of solar energy and all sorts of, it's kind of just cratering. And that is absolutely fundamental for any work that we want to do for biodiversity as well. So it's not one example, it's like a million examples, and the possibility of doing so much more.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your participation. Thank these amazing panelists. Wow, what a great afternoon. I wish we had another hour, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you all. This has been a terrific panel.